Hi, Ion Hazzikostas, the game director of World of Warcraft, gave another one of his Q&As live on Twitch yesterday. So what I'm going to go through are some of the points he brought up with some of my commentary. Quite a lot of it is sort of explaining what is coming. A little bit extra on top of what they'd said at BlizzCon. Now, there are a few things he was talking about that I'm not going to cover here because I'd already planned to do a more in-depth video on it. So that will include secondary stats revisited. I'd already talked about secondary stats quite recently, but I think after BlizzCon we need to revisit that. Item level as well, similar sort of thing. I talked about that very recently as well, but again, new information. And also the Trial of Valor. I'm going to do a Trial of Valor review now that I've sort of completed that on normal and heroic this week. So anything I've got to say on that I'll sort of save for those videos, but there's still quite a lot to talk about. Now I'm also going to put a link to the notes I'm sort of looking at are actually not my notes because I was catching up my emissary quests and doing Mythic Plus while I was listening to him. So these are on MMO Champion, and I will put a link in the description below if you want to look through them all, because I'm not going to go through all of them as well. There are some things that are not really relevant to me, such as PvP, which I don't really need to talk about. So the first thing we're talking about is about the PTR for 7.1.5. I should have done this a year ago that I got into terrible shit, because at BlizzCon they said, you know, this idea about as soon as a patch comes out, the PTR for the next patch will be straight out. And he said at BlizzCon, and the patch for 7.1.5 PTR is going to be coming out literally as soon as BlizzCon finishes. So here we are a week after BlizzCon, and he's saying, yeah, it'll be out quite soon. But no one cares because there's so much to do in Legion. It doesn't really matter. Although some people will be looking forward to 7.1.5. Do you know what? 7.1's still here, and stuff for 7.1 is still coming out. And I think everyone will be delighted about that. Now, a couple of things I will just say really quickly. One of them is related to Trial of Valor, is that next week, next reset, so Tuesday for people in North America, that means he did say Tuesday, but of course that will apply Wednesday for those in the EU realms. Any Trial of Valor gear you have will be increased by 5 item levels. Also, any legendary items you have, let's get this right, will be increased by 15 item levels up to 910. So your legendaries will be 910 item level. It talks about patch 7.3. This was announced at BlizzCon about being Argus. It said it's not a leveling experience, it's not an expansion. So but it will contain an outdoor zone as well as quests and raid. It's probably the closest thing you could liken it to, I guess. We don't know exactly what it's going to be like, but I imagine it's going to be like the Isle of Keldanas, which came out in TBC. TBC, we were on Draenor. We were completely away from Azeroth. And then for the final patch, Return to the Sunwell or whatever it was called, back to Azeroth, and on the Isle of Keldanas, and all there was a new dungeon, there was a new raid, of course, and there were a load of daily quests, which were relatively novel at the time. They'd existed before, but they were not as ubiquitous as they are now. But I imagine it's going to be like that. It may not even be any bigger than the Isle of Keldanas. It may just be like, you know, literally a zone like that with some world quests in this case rather than daily quests, and then of course the new raid. I would have hoped a new dungeon as well, but they're not talking about a new dungeon, so I think we'll just have to. We've had a new dungeon in Karazhan, sort of, and we're getting another new dungeon with 7.2. They've already said that at BlizzCon. I suppose that's a lot better than we've had recently. Now, they've also said in terms of 7.2 and Nighthold. So Nighthold, first of all, which is still 7.1, that's coming out, they've now said mid to late January. So in terms of the information they'd given out up to this point, it was sort of looking like about mid-January. So they've confirmed now mid to late January. So what they're saying is when 7.2 comes out, they expect people to still be progressing through Nighthold. Tomb of Sargeras raid will not come out with the Tomb of Sargeras patch 7.2. It'll come out a bit later. They've sort of been staggering those anyway. Like 7.1 came out. And, all right, Karazhan was there, but then Trial of Valor a couple of weeks later. And, of course, Nighthold's going to be a few months after. So they're not tying the release of a major content patch with the raid that's attached to it. which is fine. Now, the interesting thing they said here was, and I'm glad they've said this, they said Hellfire Citadel was released too soon. Now, they were saying a lot of things about the release dates of raids in Warlords of Draenor before Legion came out. And they were sort of acknowledging that Highmore wasn't out long enough, that Blackrock Foundry was out too soon, which it definitely was, it unarguably was. But the mood certainly before, I remember in Alpha when this was being discussed from developers, was that with Hellfire Citadel that was actually okay. Now, I didn't feel it was. I was ready for it in my particular guild, but I know there was a hell of a lot of others that were not. And of course, the problem is, as soon as your Hellfire Citadel comes out, if you haven't finished your progress in Blackrock Foundry, you don't carry on with it. Now, of course, there's always going to be some people still progressing in one when the next one comes out, of course. But, you know, you need a decent number to have finished it. So I'm quite pleased that they've sort of seemed to have changed their stance on that and saying that Hellfire Citadel was released too soon. Again, it might be another one with change of leadership that opinions have changed a little bit. So, yeah, it does sound like they're going to give us a decent amount of chance on Nighthold before the actual raid Tomb of Sargeras comes out. So 7.2 will come out, first of all, because of all the quests and stuff like that. Remember, they're putting a lot of emphasis in Legion on the fact that, do you know what, there's more content in this expansion than just the raids. Because that's all there was in WoD. And although it's the premium content, you would argue, for PvE players at any rate, it's not the be-all and end-all. And maybe they're deliberately uncoupling patch releases with raid releases just to emphasise that as well. Which is a good move, I think. I think that's a good move. Let's have a look. So, again, they talked about Karazhan. They said they're quite happy with Karazhan in terms of the number of people accessing it, which is fine. They don't say a great deal about that. I don't think they really need to. Secondary stats, I said I would talk about in a separate one. Artifact appearances. So they've said this before. They've actually said this twice before. But they keep emphasising it. A lot of people will naturally, of course, keep asking it. So we're not having artifacts after this expansion. After Legion's gone, we lose our artifacts. That was said long time ago. But we will be able to use the artifact appearances as like transmog. So it'll be saved into our wardrobe. They've also said that they will come up with a system to allow Feral and Guardian Druids to be able to save their special forms as well that are tied to the artifacts. They'd already said that before even Legion came out as well. But again, it's just to emphasise that, you know, any sort of looks that you've got that's attached to your artifact weapon, they will make sure that you can access them later. They also said something else quite interesting. This was sort of quite new in that they seem to, or Ian seemed to suggest that even after Legion, there will still be a way to get those artifact skin looks. Which wouldn't have been, you know, if you think about it, if you had to get them the way we get them now, it's not going to be that straightforward when Legion is no longer the current expansion. So they're sort of thinking of I think he said it was time limited, if I remember rightly, which might imply that there will come a point at which you won't be able to obtain them anymore. In terms of model updates, they've obviously updated all the sort of, a lot of the character models since then. People are now asking for goblins and worgens to be updated. Of course, when, you know, they were relatively new when they started updating the older ones, but they, you know, some people looking at them and thinking, well, they could do with an update now. So I think they said something about that at BlizzCon. But what they have said, which is not for directly for players, is that they will be updating the look of the Death Knight ghouls and the Frost Mage Water Elemental at some point. They didn't say when. Now, on the issue of legendary items, which of course is a key cornerstone of this expansion. So first of all, they've said that they're not supposed to be all equal. They'll never be all equal. But what they want to avoid is having legendaries that you just don't feel like taking at all. So they're going to retune legendaries. They're going to try and make some of the crap ones more useful. They're also going to maybe tone down some of the powerful ones. Now, the ones they've noted are like Mage and Death Knight wrists. I think they said specifically Unholy Death Knight and Fire Mage wrists. They didn't say the ret ring or cloak, so hopefully that's going to be fine. Because otherwise, knowing my luck, they'll nerf the cloak and that's when I'll get it. Except I've decided this weekend I'm getting my 3rd legendary. I've actually decided, and I've pretty much settled on the fact that I want the cloak. So yeah, I expect that to drop this weekend. Otherwise, I'm not going to be happy. I shall be filling in a bug report. So it also emphasised the fact they're going to be adding new legendaries. Now, other people from Blizzard that were talking about this at BlizzCon and just after BlizzCon were a bit coy on exactly when they'd come in. I was talking about this in the news update yesterday. Ian seems to be suggesting that they'd be coming out with 7.1.5. It seemed to be a suggestion rather than a definite, but from what he was saying, it sounded to me, and bear in mind I was a little distracted because I wasn't doing anything majorly challenging. I'm pretty sure it suggested that they'd be out before 7.2. And of course, this is at the point when they add more in that they'd already said, again, a long time ago, that at that point they'll think about ways of allowing you to target certain ones. But don't get too excited about that, because I'd be thinking in terms of that, and okay, maybe the way you target the one that's really good for you is by doing content that actually you don't do a lot of. So quite how easy that's going to be is another thing. But they have noted that, I mean, this is tied to the item level, but I'll mention it here specifically for legendaries, that it's not good. The idea of getting a legendary and you're actually disappointed because you can't wear it, it's not good. Yeah, even the stats aren't good enough. And that's what they said is the legendary effect, forget about the utility as they call it, the actual stats themselves should mean that you're using it. So with some of them, that's not the case, of course, and they want to rectify that. Of course, part of the reason you can be disappointed because let's say you already have 2 legendaries and you're equipping 2 legendaries and you get a 3rd one that doesn't replace either of those 2. Of course, that would be disappointing, unless you already had the 2 best anyway in every situation. Although I doubt there's always 2 best in every situation. But that's not what they're talking about. I mean, they are talking about the situation where you would be able to equip it even if just the stats were better, and people are going, well, it's not. So I'm not going to be doing that. They have said on the point of view of equipping legendaries, they have no plans to allow us to equip more than 2. People were assuming, I think, that certainly by the time 7.2 came out, especially if they're going to add more legendaries into the mix, that surely they'll give us a 3rd legendary slot somehow. So what they've said, they haven't vetoed it. They haven't said, no, this isn't happening. They've just said, there are no plans to. There are no plans to, and no, this isn't happening. There's a world apart with those 2 things. But they're not thinking in terms of that, certainly. I talked about the quick join thing yesterday. He talked about this again. They have confirmed that they are going to disable the sound of the toast from the quick join. The quick join, for those who aren't sure about it, it's the idea, what this is to stop you is, let's say you have someone on your friends list or someone in your guild who signs up for a random dungeon, let's say, or LFR, and you do the same. It's like, well, you might as well do it together. So it's a way of sort of notifying you if someone on your friends list or in your guild is basically signing up for the same random content you are, and would you like to join together? But it was quite annoying for some people. I noticed it myself. It obviously doesn't happen. But then again, I haven't been queuing up for a lot of random stuff recently. But apparently it's quite annoying. So, and I talked yesterday in my Wire Flash about there's an add-on someone's already brought out. But Blizzard are going to disable the sound from it. So you'll just get the visual notification. In terms of hidden things, they said they're quite like the hidden things in Legion. People seem to be getting on with it. All the sort of content that's not announced, but you sort of found it in reality. Some people find it and then you read about it on forums. But they do quite like that. And I think, that's fair enough. I think a lot of people have been quite positive about that. A lot of it related to hidden skins for the artifacts. So, and they've said that there's still some small things that have yet to be discovered. So there are some things in game. They quite like there being things in game that people don't know about, that they don't know that they're there. And they like the idea of people discovering them. They'd quite like to keep having things in game that you wouldn't necessarily discover by data mining. obviously that's a bit, if you put an item in a game, for example, someone is going to data mine it. So they quite like the idea that there's some hidden things in there that it's not so easy to do that with. And I think a lot of the player base appreciate that as well. They've going to say, in terms of hidden artifact appearances, there's going to be some bad luck protection on that in a future patch. But who knows which one. And they've also said hidden appearances that come from world bosses. We knew this anyway, that were sort of random are now sort of set, because world bosses come around very infrequently. There's a lot of them, and they sort of cycle around. One thing he clarified was on the class mounts. Now, of course, we saw the new class mounts at BlizzCon last week. Some of them look good, some look amazing, some of them look not so good. And then it was announced that for certain specs, some of them will look different. And we knew, the impression was not given that every spec would have its own unique mount, even if it was just a recolor. It was sort of stated that this was for some classes. He's now clarified it a little bit further, so I don't think it's as extensive as we might have thought. And he's basically said where it makes sense, or to put it another way, where it doesn't make sense for two specs within the same class to have the same mount, then there will be a different one. And the example he gave was between, say, Shadow and Holy or Disciplined Priests. So I think it'll be much more limited than we sort of thought would be the case from that. I'm guessing from that. So I think for the majority of people, it will look the same. For the majority of classes, it will look the same. Kirin Tor quest, they've said if you're noticing you're not getting so many Kirin Tor in terms of the emissary, that's because they were not supposed to be that common. He said they were noticing sometimes they're popping up twice a week. They don't want that. They want them to pop up about twice every 3 weeks. So they've toned down. They've reduced the chance of them popping up. They said if it turns out that they're just not popping up very often at all, they'll increase the chance again. But that's just like a tuning thing. They want them to be like nice. I like them. I actually look forward to the Kirin Tor quest. I do quite like them. I especially like the Enigma quests. As I mentioned when the first ones came out, I did a video on that. I love doing those. Auction house, there's more auction house improvements going. What they're basically saying is you shouldn't need an add-on to get the best out of an auction house. So the same, but they acknowledge that it makes it a lot easier to use. So what they're wanting to do is to bring more, I suppose, of those elements of the add-ons into the game itself, so that we won't feel the need for an add-on. They have talked about one thing that I'm not sure about, which is the idea that you can buy part of a stack. I'm not sure how the seller would feel about that or how that would work, really. So it's like the idea, let's say you put a load of things on with stacks of 20, which is a damn sight better than putting 453 Fjarnskargel in stacks of 1. Stop doing that. Stop it. I mean it. But let's say you put in on 20. 20 is fine. And that someone could come along and just say, buy 7 of them. Because then I would think, as the seller's thinking, well, then there's a stack of 13, and maybe people don't want 13s of them, they want 20s. Most people, anyway. And it makes it less saleable. So I'm not sure about that one. I'm not sure what the people think. Maybe put comments below if you've got an opinion on that one. But I am very positive about the fact that they're going to introduce a lot more customization to the auction house. They haven't given a time limit on it. It's one of those things that sounds like it's mid-priority. They're aware something needs doing, but they've probably got a lot of other priorities to deal with at the same time. Because I'm not even sure which team would be in charge of that. Obviously, it wouldn't be the class development team. I'm not entirely sure which team it would be. So again, it might be that they've got a lot of higher priority things to sort out as well. Bonus rolls, they've mentioned this before. They've mentioned a couple of things. Well, first of all, when you fail a coin roll and you get gold, it's basically a kick in the teeth. As has been pointed out, one of the ways you can get these coins in the first place, remember, is by paying gold. I'm now in a position where I can just use my order resource, because I've got no use for anything else, really, apart from the odd mission. But if people are using gold, it's like 1,000 for the first one and then 2,000 for the second one, for example. So even at 1,000 gold, and you get like 30 gold back, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth. It's like you spent 1,000 gold to get 30 gold. Thanks. Thank you. Great. So what they've said is artifact power will be better. They've already said this before. They've said it a couple of times. But, you know, the strange thing is they're saying they're working towards allowing you to get artifact power instead. Now, obviously, I don't understand the first thing about game design in terms of the technical side of it. But isn't that strange? I would have thought that would be quite straightforward, unless what they're thinking about is how much artifact power to give. But I would have thought, I mean, that can't be the sticking point, because you would just get it to give something. The equivalent of, like, the daily dungeon or something like that. Because it's only for like one a week or maximum 3 or 4. Sometimes you get 5 a week, actually, I have to say, because, you know, I got 1 from a mission this week, the 3 normal ones, plus there's 1 for the time walking dungeons. There's 5 on offer this week. And if all 5 fail, just getting the equivalent of like a daily dungeon, doing the daily random dungeon, wouldn't be overpowered. So you could just start off with that, and then if you feel it should be more, then you can up it. So it must be something else. It must be something technical, but it sounds strange to me that they can't just make it give you artifact power instead. So that's a weird one. But yeah, they are looking at that. You would think they're going to do that sooner rather than later, because that. But it sounds weird to say working towards. I don't really get that. It was talking a bit about teleports to dungeons. Of course, in the past, you know, when you've done challenge mode, you get teleports to those dungeons as a sort of reward. And I think the point it was trying to make is, in terms of why we don't have that, is that in the original challenge mode dungeons, you got cosmetic rewards. There was nothing, which is why I didn't bother with them. You know, it was prestige, as he says, and achievements and things like that. Nothing concrete. Whereas now we do get actual rewards that improve the strength of our character. We get gear, we get artifact power, and so we don't really need the other stuff. It'd be still useful to teleport around to dungeons directly, though. But, I mean, it's not one I feel strongly about anyway. But I think he was just explaining why we don't have them this time round. And final thing I was really talking about, apart from, as I say, the things that I'm going to talk about in more detail later, are underpowered specs. And I pointed out 2 here. There was Elemental Shamans and Brewmaster Monks for 2 different reasons. Elemental Shamans, they're acknowledging that they may appear to be not great in dungeons because their strength lies in AoE. There hasn't been a great call for that in Emerald Nightmare. And if you think about it, that's also the case in Trial of Valor. They're essentially single target bosses. There's sometimes the odd little bit of AoE required, but it's in short bursts. Now, looking ahead at Nighthold, there'll be a few different things in there. But they have sort of noted they might have to do something with Elemental Shamans because, yeah, it looks bad when, for raids, if you're looking weak because your strength lies in content that isn't in those raids, then that's not great. Now, Brewmaster, they say, is the opposite problem. Brewmaster, they say, is really strong, but people don't see it. Now, I don't know very much about either of these specs, but certainly not Brewmaster monks. But I do distinctly remember a period during Alpha when Brewmaster was not one of the first ones they released. It was released much later. But when they did release it into the Alpha to test, a lot of people had a lot of issues with it. And the response from developers was, you're using it wrong. Now, my thoughts at the time, I think I may have mentioned something at the time, were that if you've got people who are good players and they're playing this thing, and they're not keen on it, and you're telling them that they're playing it wrong, those good players, okay, if you sort of give, and they sort of said how they should be playing it, those players will go, oh, all right, yeah, okay, we can see that now. But what about the vast majority of other players? Now, the point they're making with the Brewmaster Monk is, without going into too much detail, is a lot of healers maybe think that they're quite weak because you're taking a lot of damage, and the healers are thinking to themselves, or they're saying, actually, out loud, I can't heal you to full. I can just never heal you to full. What's up with you? And that puts a negative perception in their mind that Brewmasters are just constantly taking too much damage. Whereas Blizzard's point of view is, yes, they're always taking this damage, but it's very predictable. And do you know what? They don't actually die. They're actually one of the most survivable tanks. And they said that the not dying is what matters. So it's a perception thing. But nonetheless, perceptions are really powerful. Now, Blizzard did sort of say here, do they have to buff something to ridiculously broken levels just to get the community to look at it? And assuming that a spec is great and just not played much, and no one wants it in the group, what is the solution? I would say the solution is you don't buff it if it is already strong. You change the way it plays. Because what this is, again, haven't had to really say this in Legion so far. I think they've been pretty good. Had to say it a few times in WoD. But they sometimes get a bit petulant, developers. And it's a bit like, well, we've given you all these great things, what's up here? And I don't know about Brewmasters. They might be fantastic. No reason to doubt them. But if the perception is that they're not, sorry, Blizzard are, even though you can't say to the community, which is millions of players, change your perception. Blizzard have to do something. So if the perception is the style of Brewmaster tanking is not to their liking, that's what you change. I'm not saying change mid-expansion. I mean, I'm not keen on massive changes to classes mechanics mid-expansion. But for the next expansion, just think it, instead of getting defensive and sticking stubbornly to your guns, just think to yourself, do you know what? The community, even though we think it's a really great idea and it works in practice, the community doesn't really like it. I mean, but yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about this. I had no idea that Brewmaster monks were perceived as being really weak tanks at all. I thought, you know, that might be because in the guild I was at the start of Legion, we had a really good Brewmaster monk, and we don't have one at all in the guild I'm in now. So I've got nothing really to compare it to. I've only known one Brewmaster monk in Legion, and he certainly wasn't dying all the time. But he was a very good player of it. So I don't know, you know. But if Blizzard are saying, you know, if the community perception is that they're weak, and Blizzard are saying, well, this is a perception because of the way they take damage. Sorry. It might look good in terms of numbers. You might think to yourself, we've come up with a unique way of playing this tank because we've got 6 tanks. I can understand where they're coming from. You know, you've got 6 tanks. You want them all to have their differences. But, you know, if the community don't like it, you can first of all try and educate them. But it's no good saying stuff on forums because, as Blizzard say themselves, hardly anyone reads them. A very small percentage of the player base read the forums. So your next problem is, so you've got to try and educate people en masse. How do you do that? Well, if you've got no way of doing that, then you just change it. You can't have Brewmaster Monk players. It's fucked over, you know, because the community doesn't want that style of play. You've got to change that style of play to suit what the community does want. Give your customers what you want. Simple. Anyway, enough on that one. It's a weird one to end on, actually. But those are the things he was talking about. As I say, there's quite a lot of things I now want to talk about separately. I'm hoping to cover the secondary stats one later on today. But I've got several things I do want to get done this weekend. I know I won't be able to get them all done. So it's a case of me just seeing what I can get done. And then other ones hopefully into the next week. But of course, Mythic Trial of Valor will be out next week. So that will occupy a lot of my planning time as well. But anyway, thanks for watching so far. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. And until next time, I'll see you later.